Good evening. I am Marjorie Schuster, coordinator of our literary events here at the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center. I welcome our distinguished guests and all of you. This is a very busy semester at the Streicker Center as we welcome you on Zoom and we attempt to lure you back to live programming. We're hosting Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt, Lin-Manuel Miranda, Katie Couric, Chris Christie, Chris Wallace, Anderson Cooper, and we've just added a really fun evening with Andy Cohen. Please take a look at our website and join us. Now, on to tonight's program. 1 year ago, more than 60,000 new COVID cases were reported across the country, and 250,000 people had already died. Hospitals were reeling, scrambling to find extra beds and extra staff. But staff was hard to find since nurses were exhausted. They were treating patients in hallways, in tents, and in parking lots. And this is all on top of what they had been doing to save all of our lives before COVID turned our world upside down. Best-selling authors James Patterson and Matt Eversmann have paid tribute to them in their new book, ER Nurses. And they join us tonight to honor the nurses who are at their very best when we are at our worst. James Patterson does not need a lot of introduction. He's written 242 bestsellers and most recently a thriller with President Bill Clinton. Co-author Matt Eversmann was a member of the Special Forces Unit whose daring survival story was told in Black Hawk Down. And author, journalist, and filmmaker Sebastian Junger is most noted for his book, The Perfect Storm, a New York Times #1 bestseller. If you have any questions for our guests, please type them in the chat function of Zoom at any time, and we will get to as many as we possibly can. Now, please welcome James Patterson, Matt Eversmann, and Sebastian Junger.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you two. I have a million questions, and I hope we have a kind of good old-fashioned conversation about your extraordinary book.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm honored to be part of this, and thanks for having me. I guess as a journalist, as an author, I guess I'd like to start by asking both of you, what brought you together? How did you conceive of this book? How did it start? How did it take shape? What just
Well, like all good stories, Sebastian, it started in a bar. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, it really did. And Sebastian, you might get a kick out of this. A couple of years ago, a mutual friend of Jim and mine, it turns out, wanted to go to Afghanistan to do a little documentary about battlefield trauma and how we've advanced with battlefield medicine post-Somalia, and land his plane on a short runway. Before we went, Tim Malloy said, hey, why don't we sit down with Jim and just kind of find out from an expert about storytelling? So we did, in a bar, And I closed with the punchline to answer your question. Jim said one of the most profound things to me when he said, Matt, everybody out here has a story. Everybody's got one really good story in them. And if we can get them to tell it, we've done something really cool. And I bounce it back to Jim, but that was sort of what the catalyst for me. Like, how do we tell some good stories?
And we started, Sebastian, with vets and walking our combat boots, and now we're on to nurses.
Right. Yeah, I remember. All I know of Black Hawk Down was the film, which I thought was a good film. But one of the things that stands out is a horrifying scene where someone was wounded in their leg, I think, and he was bleeding to death, and they were trying to sort of operate on him and close off the artery, while under fire in this dusty building. It was just a nightmare. I don't think they succeeded. I think they lost him. That's my memory of that terrible day via the movie. And so, I can see, I can see a line from that to a topic such as this. How did you go about choosing the subjects of the people you talk to? There's an incredible scope and breadth to it. What was your process like?
Well, we started with, I have a lot of connections to colleges and scholarships and whatever. So we started with University of Wisconsin, University of Florida, Columbia, a few places where we have contacts. And then, Matt, go ahead. Matt had a lot of contacts too.
Yeah, and we started with battlefield. I mean, back to trauma medicine, Sebastian, and this link between the military and the civilian world. And once you talk to one A+ person, and if you can squeeze them at the end to introduce you to a friend, they're going to be pretty much A++. And we had that. I mean, we really did. It was amazing, and I think. Particularly for nurses, Jim had said, listen, we want to cover big and small from west to east, north to south. Let's get it all. And I think we did.
Sebastian, and you know this about a lot of people coming back from the military, from war, whatever, men and women, they don't really want to talk about it to civilians. Most don't. And therefore, most people don't understand the military at all. So what we wanted to do with that book was to get people to understand. And then with nurses, it's the same thing. A lot of them, they don't want to talk about it very much. And people really don't. People think they understand nurses. Oh, yeah, our heroes. They don't understand it at all. Yeah. And at the end of this book, in my opinion, they will get it for the first time in their lives. They'll really understand what nurses do. And how shows like Grey's Anatomy, I'm not really knocking the show per se, but man, it's the nurses. The doctors you see 5 minutes a day, the nurses are there. They're living it all day.
Yeah. I think I'm going by memory here, I think there are 57 interviews in the book. Is that right?
Yeah.
You must have done many more interviews than that to come up with those 57. What were your criteria for the ones on the cutting room floor, as it were? What was that?
Yeah, we did. Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
Well, yeah, Sebastian.
He's the one that cut all the good people.
Yeah, I was the bad guy. I'm the heavy. No, they really were all good. I mean, they all are amazing. And I say that sort of prefacing if anyone that's watching wasn't in it, it was purely out of, you can't write a 3,000 page, book for this thing. But Jim, I would do the interview and then transcribe it and sort of take the first guess at what I thought might be some interesting threads, and then I'd take it over to Jim's house, and he would, then work the magic. And I mean, you got the master here that.
Well, we didn't want to have a book of 50-page interviews, which I think would have been tedious for people to read. And I think this is a book, I mean, and your response to it was, I mean, you don't put it down, which people don't expect about this kind of book, because it is story after story after story. And it's all true. And there's no political stuff. We're on nobody's, here's the stories, man. Make of it what you will. And I think, when we did Combat Boots, we would say the next time that you thank somebody for their service, you'll know what you're thanking them for. And I think it's the same thing with this book. Yeah. And I hope it stimulates more people to just walk up to nurses and say, thanks.
Right.
You're great. You're great.
Yeah. So I in the 1980s, I guess, when I was a young man, I wanted to be a writer, and I was reading everything good I could get my hands on. And someone gave me Studs Terkel, a book called Working, a much longer book than yours, but I think a similar concept. I mean, it was just one long book of interviews of working people. Was that a reference point for you guys? Are you familiar with that book?
I'm familiar with it. It wasn't a working point. I remember, and part of it is I just felt in this age personally that we needed something even tighter and more dramatic than what Studs did. But yes, I was familiar, and I did read a lot of it back then. He might have even been a couple of them that he wrote out of Chicago. Yeah. I
think he did. Yeah, and there's something very powerful about. I mean, I'm a writer. You're a writer. We're used to turning reality into words that people can appreciate, but there's something extremely powerful about just first-person testimony, directly from people. Testimony directly from people. Of course, you tighten it, you abbreviate it. We all know that you have to do that when this speech is cumbersome and unwieldy, and when you quote people, you have to be sort of smart about it. But at the end of the day, I find this kind of testimony to be an extremely powerful form.
Yeah.
And moving, like emotional in a way that sort of prose aren't necessarily. Did you find that as going through this material, was it emotional for you?
Oh, totally. Yeah. And I'll get into Matt but just the truth, we're all aching for the truth now. Book after book, people will read about the Trump White House or now the Biden White House, whatever, and they try to get through this stuff to get to the truth. I think we got to the truth with this book, because there was no reason for people to hide stuff. And there it is, Matt. Go ahead, Matt. I mean, because Matt, I don't think you mentioned it, but Matt was actually he was the model for the sergeant in Black Hawk Down. He was there. I don't know if we got into that piece of it with Black Hawk Down, but I mean, Matt, you've been through it, and just the effect of these nurses' testimonies on you was
it absolutely was. I mean, Jim is telling the truth. I mean, to the fact that there were a couple of times that I said to Jim at the end of delivering, some of my weekly interviews that, Jim, I really need to take a break. I got to take a couple of days to just process what I've listened to. And when I say that, I really wasn't prepared. It's one thing we talk about. There was some traumatic event, in a car wreck, and you hear it or you read it in the paper or whatever, and it's just white noise. But when you hear, a 20-something or a 30-something talking to you for a couple of hours about, these moments of, a 2-year-old or a 90-year-old and something traumatic happening, it really starts to wear on you. And I only had to listen to it once. So that really was, it was tremendously emotional for me. And I don't want to put words in Jim's mouth, but that point, I think, you got to sort of take a break and take a knee and drink some water and think about it a little bit, because it's a tough job, and they're angels among us.
Yeah. Well, so Matt, I'm wondering, so because of your experience in 1993, were you interviewed afterwards by journalists, or I blanked on the name of the guy that wrote the book, but were you interviewed? Did you have the experience at the other end of the microphone?
I did. Mark Bowden was the journalist, and the true story. Not to get off subject, but when we got back and the floodgates opened, and it was just like you and you be in the conference room and you're going to talk. And I mean, there were some, looking back on it, was some pretty spectacular journalists that, David Martin and Bowden, and then some, sort of the who's who. But to be quite honest, I really don't remember anything about those interviews other than telling a story. They tell me what happened, and you would just go. So I have seen it from both sides. And if I just toss this one out now, shut up. With these nurses, with these trauma nurses, trauma is the operative word, and for better or for worse, have had some real experience. So I could at least share one experience that I had with them and say, I really do know a little bit about what I'm talking about, but tell me more.
Right. I imagine that must have helped create trust, and trust is a huge factor in how an interview is going to go, and particularly sort of emotional trust, because people that are being interviewed are often talking about things that are extremely personal and painful, and they want to know that the other I assume they want to know the other person is sort of in their camp emotionally and isn't going to misuse what they're saying. And if you had gone through trauma as well, I imagine that must have created some trust there that was really helpful to the process.
I hope so. I do. And I don't want to sound that, Sebastian, like I'm
That's
so
why we got together, because when Matt went over with my friend Malloy and they made their film, and Matt did a lot of the interviews, and I went, this guy really is the terrific interviewer, because he does put people at ease, and he gets, in that case, the soldiers to talk about things that could be difficult, because they trust him. They know he's been there. They know he knows what he's talking about. He asks the right follow-up questions. And that's why, and I had that notion of walking my combat boots, because I felt, from when my father came back from World War II, he never talked about what happened over there. And I knew, and one of my best friends was in Vietnam, and he never talked about it. And I knew that we didn't understand the military. And I felt with Matt that we could do a book and people would get it for the first times in their life. And as I said, and people aren't going to believe it who are watching here, they think they understand nurses. They do not understand nurses. And one of the really glorious things so far is when nurses read this book, they will go, "You nailed it." One nurse, which was an interesting thing about, she gave it to her mother. Mother read it over the weekend. The mother came to her house and she was crying, and she said, "I never really understood what you do. And now I do. And I love you so much. And you're so wonderful." And, because.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's really powerful. I feel like as a journalist, as a writer, if we can give people, even for a moment, give people tools to connect better to other people that they love, to understand their lives, their experiences a little bit better, that's the point of the job, right? It makes journalism in some ways a kind of sacred duty, right? And by sacred, I mean it helps people lead better, more dignified lives because they have a little bit of understanding. And one of the highest compliments I ever got was I wrote about a platoon in combat, and one of the soldiers said, he read the manuscript, and he said, a guy I'm still very close to, he said, "Wow, Sebastian, you've explained us to ourselves." And that was such a great.
Yeah. Well, right, exactly. We all have those experiences where we can't really put it in words. And then somebody, when they do, they go, "Yes, that you've taken all those jumbled thoughts in my head and turned them into a coherent thought."
Right. And as a war reporter, many times I've been in danger and almost lost my life. And that trauma is actually surprisingly easy to get past. I put it behind me fairly easily. The trauma that is impossible to dislodge, and decades later, it's just some of these things are still stuck in my mind and can bring me to tears very quickly if I think about them for too long or talk about them, is harm coming to others, harm to children, like seeing people, particularly children who have been hurt, who have died in terrible circumstances. That is something that one can't really recover from. And that is what nurses do, right? That's what they do and doctors every day in the ER. They are confronting harm that's come to other people and children. How do they, to both of you, do you have any idea how they cope with that? Soldiers come back from the war zone. Nurses are in there day in, day out at home. And what does it do to them?
I think they just have a habit of just being tough, and they're going to tough it out. And that's an area where I think they need help, and we need to give them help. I think, and Matt knows this, and you know this, and it's covered in your book Tribe a bit. We're beginning to realize the help we need to give to veterans, some veterans, when they get back and have to deal. we're not doing that with the nurses. It's just tough it out and come out into work again tomorrow and, whatever, like get over COVID and, because we need you.
Right.
It's an interesting phenomenon.
If I could just jump in real quick, Sebastian, to piggyback on Jim's comment, these men and women, as you rightly say, they're deployed their entire working life. Like that's there's no coming home, red, yellow, green cycle. They're back and they're going all the time. And I've always thought, there's only a finite amount of bad stuff that we can all process, and to where I'm going with this is that, soldiers in 20 years of war, we've made post-traumatic stress an acceptable term. It comes out, it rolls off your tongue as we're discussing it. Soldiers go for treatment. The commands talk about it. And like Jim was saying, I get off the phone talking to these nurses, and I think, my gosh, after I have a drink, I got to call them back and just make sure they're okay. Or I got to send them an email just to check because of just that. Listen, you got the gym rats, you got the, go have a drink afterward. You got a little bit of everything, but I worry about that because, they're getting that. Here's a coloring book. Just tell me the color of your feelings kind of stuff.
One of the nurses, having read the book, said to us, this was a podcast and he was a moderator, and he said he read the book and it just made him feel once again how much he loves being a nurse.
Yeah.
And one of the things, and this is true, I think of, and Matt, we talk about this quite a bit, when soldiers are over in a war zone, whatever, they have a purpose, they have a mission, they have a purpose in life. These nurses have a purpose in life, a meaning. There's meaning to their life. And a lot of us, in this world, we're searching for that meaning. And some people will find it in the family, and some people, they're like, I hate my job. I don't, most nurses, there's meaning. They know they're doing something significant and important and good.
I don't think you touched on this in your book, but retiring from that profession must be quite hard. I know soldiers that come back from deployment, and strangely, particularly deployments that were very active and in a lot of combat, where they were in a small, tight unit and they completely relied on each other, and they made it home. And some of these guys had an enormously hard time giving up that experience and returning to civilian life. That, I imagine, that has to be true in the nursing profession as well. Did you hear people talk about that?
We did have a couple. We had a couple that had been doing this, 35 or 40 years. I think we even had one that might have been close to 50 at shock trauma in Baltimore. But what I recall to that point, Sebastian, they get out and they work for the Red Cross. They get out and they volunteer. One of them, did a big, goes on mission trips, to provide medical support. I don't think they can shake it. It's still, part of that blood. It is such a similarity, I must say, and I know it sounds a little weaselly, but the soldier's heart, nurse's heart are the same. They're very, very similar animals, and they're like Jim was saying, their identity, their mission, their selflessness, their heroism, their courage, they do it all. And it's I think you're right. They don't shake it. I think they just take it with them and find a new way to kind of stay a little bit, with the tribe, so to speak. No pun intended. Pardon me for, that was
telling you your title of your book.
Yeah, I know. I was like, well, I can't believe I just said that out loud. What a knucklehead.
Listen, I didn't invent the word tribe, so it's all fair. Well, I'd like to actually suggest something that might be helpful to these people that you've connected to in this profession. I know a lot of soldiers, a lot of veterans, and I developed an idea sort of based on Native American ceremonies where after combat, in some of the Plains tribes, the warriors that had come back, and of course, imagine the combat back then. In that era, how bloody, how hand-to-hand, how bloody and traumatic it must have been. So these guys would come back, and the community, the tribe, would give them the chance to sing and dance and tell the story of their heroism, of their feats, of what they did for their tribe, right? And it was enormously cathartic. And not only was it cathartic for the individual, it allowed or forced the entire community to morally participate in what was happening in the war, in the fighting, in the bloodshed. And so we tried to do this in town halls. It's called Veterans Town Hall. And basically every year on Veterans Day, and on my website, you can look this up. Every year on Veterans Day, you open up the town hall in your town. It's very easy to organize, and every veteran can speak for 10 minutes about what it was like to serve the country in whatever war they were in whatever capacity. And some are very angry, some are very proud, some are crying too hard to talk, and then they step down after 10 minutes. But it allows the community to understand, and it allows for a kind of emotional connection that's very helpful. So the long point, but my point is, I wonder if it might not be possible to organize something similar, around the community that surrounds every hospital, of a kind of sort of oral testimony of some of these people in front of their people, their families and their friends, and in the community. It might be enormously therapeutic, just to put it out there.
No, I think it would be. I think it would be. Yeah.
Yeah. So Veterans Town Hall would be the template. It's easy to find online. So I have actually a sort of interesting personal story about your book. I read it on my first airplane trip since COVID started, which was last May, I think it was, or April. And I wasn't sure what to expect. And I started reading it in the airplane, and I really got choked up. I got extremely emotional, and, men don't really like to cry in public. And there I was struggling in seat, 7D or whatever. I think there were a couple of reasons for it. I think trauma is sort of one size fits all in a way. So if you're traumatized in a war and you read about any other kind of trauma in any other kind of situation, it stirs up a lot of feelings. And of course, I went through some things in my reporting, but specifically, some months earlier, I almost died. I had an undiagnosed aneurysm in my abdomen. My pancreatic artery had an aneurysm. It was undiagnosed, asymptomatic, and it ruptured without warning, just one afternoon. It just burst, and I bled out into my abdomen. And I was in terrific pain, and the ambulance crew got me to the hospital. It took them 90 minutes to get me to the ER. And I'd lost almost all my blood. I lost 3/4 of my blood by then. I was on the threshold of death. My dead father appeared, welcoming me. I'm an atheist, and he was a physicist, and I don't know what he was doing. But there he was welcoming me, and I wanted to have nothing to do with him. I was like, Dad, go away. They put 10 units of blood into my neck, in my jugular, and they saved my life. And I have very spotty memories of all this. I have 2 little girls. They have a father because of the incredible work of these people in this hospital, tiny little local hospital. And I got incredibly emotional. And one of the reasons is that every person, I think there's 3 people in your book that have abdominal bleeding, and they all die, right? I mean, it's one of the things where the ER staff is like, he doesn't have a chance. And by some miracle, I lived. But reading that was really affecting to me.
Yeah.
And I, so I just have to say, like, all of us, all of you all listening right now, everyone in this country, you 2 guys, all of us one day are going to be in the ER for one reason or another. And there are going to be people trying very hard to save our lives. And, I guess I would like to ask you, like, have either of you guys been, on the gurney in an ER? Have your lives been saved by people like this?
I'll give you a little different experience. In the book, there are a couple things where there's one where this nurse, this guy's dying, and she asks the wife, what does he love? What can I do? And she says he loves his dog. And she sneaks the dog into the hospital. There's another one, it actually might even be the same nurse, rule breaker that she is. And she lets the wife sleep with the husband. And when I was in my 30s, I was with a woman who got a brain tumor and she was dying at Columbia Presbyterian. And almost every night they let me sleep with her. So once again, it was against the rules, but I was there every night, and this went on for a couple of years. When she was out, she was in, she was out, she was in. And so I really, totally, that experience, matched something that had happened to me in terms of just the humanity you can find in hospitals.
Yeah, that's very moving. Matt, how have you managed to dodge the ER in your life?
No, well, so this, just to bring it on a little bit of a lighter note for a second, I actually did go to the ER for the first time right before we were really getting this thing started, and COVID had just hit. And the long story not so long, my appendix, just blew up. And I went to urgent care, and they're like, "Hey, man, you should go down to the emergency room." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." So my wife took me. No one can come in with you. Yeah. And I'm a knucklehead. I've never been. So I walk into the ER. I'm the only one there, thankfully. And so my experience could have gotten bad if I'd waited another day. But at the moment, I didn't really know enough. But I got to see all these nurses, the whole team, like to myself. And so as we were going through triage, there was the good-natured joking, there was whatever. And as we've talked about through this book, several times, Sebastian, while we've talked about this several times, you spend all the time in the ER with these nurses, and my punchline to it all is like, thankfully it all went fine. I really don't think I was in any danger. We got it early enough. But what I told a couple of these nurses, I said, it dawned on me, first of all, you see us at our most vulnerable. I mean, literally when you are naked, bare on the table, you're there, and you're the last person I'm gonna see. And I remember
one of the things that was interesting to me, Sebastian, and I didn't expect this. If any of us decided we wanted to write a book about the underbelly of this country, what's really going on, people that don't have a lot, think people that are in trouble, people that are having mental problems, whatever. I wouldn't know where to start. Now I do. Emergency rooms. Yeah. They see this all the time. The first time I read in the interviews about somebody burning the children, I went, oh my God. Then I see it's a common occurrence. People burn their children. It's like insanity. There was one story there about they had to bring this 600-pound plus woman into the hospital. They couldn't figure out how the hell to get her in. They finally brought her in through the receiving doors, and she had a box springs physically attached to her body. She'd been laying in the bed so long, and they had to bring the fire department in to remove the box springs. And just these stories, you go like, I can't believe this. These stories, I mean, you believe them, but you can't believe them. And there's a lot of stories like there's another one, which a little different thing, but it was a black flight nurse, and it was a black pilot out in Oklahoma. And there was an emergency situation out in the sticks, and they go to rescue this person, and they get in close to this farm, and there's all swastikas and white supremacist stuff all over the barns. And they're like, oh man, down they go, and they rescue this white supremacist and save a life. And it doesn't matter. I mean, they're going to do it. As I said before, there's no politics in this book.
Yeah, right. Well, the last thing I remember when I was down 10 units of blood and on the and dying. I mean, actively dying. I was, I think, minutes from being dead. I felt myself going, and the last thing I remember saying to the doctor, he was cutting my neck open to get at my jugular to put a line in. I said, "Doc, you got to hurry. You're losing me right now." And that was almost the last thing I ever said to anyone. They managed to save me, and the next day in the ICU, I had no idea that I'd almost died. Absolutely no idea. I just woke up confused, and the nurse told me what had happened. She was like, "We can't believe you're alive. You almost died yesterday." Then she left me with that news, and then went to do something else, and came back an hour later and said, "Hey, Mr. Junger, how you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm okay, but honestly, I'm struggling a little bit with what you told me." Uh-huh. And it's terrifying that you can almost die in your own driveway as a healthy person. That boom, you just drop, you're dead. That's it. And she said the most amazing thing to me. She said, try, instead of thinking about that as something scary, try thinking about it as something sacred. You were taken to the edge and allowed to look over, and then you were allowed to come back. That's sacred knowledge. And then she turned and walked out of the room again. Gave me something to think about.
Yeah.
So I feel like, do you feel like these people who are working right on that threshold of life and death, do you think it gives them a kind of wisdom like that about all of our lives? Like, is there something in there?
Jim, if I just jump in real quick, I think, as I recall from all these interviews, listen, let's face it, dealing with that subject is not something people like to talk about. None of us do. We don't. And, in this book, you hear, the whole spectrum, the miraculous to the courageous to the very sympathetic. And what I gathered from these nurses, and it's really much like soldiers, we're talking 20-somethings, that are having these kinds of conversations, or that have to process and go out and tell a family sad news, or they make it unbelievably beautiful. And there are several stories in there, of the hand holding at the end, these moments of unbelievable compassion and love that they do. And then they got to flip that switch and go out and do, deal with somebody that's acting up and, being nasty. They're I know I'm rambling a little bit about it, but they're amazing that they deal with this and dance around this subject with ease.
There's also, Sebastian, several stories where people do come back. It seems like there was one 2-year-old and he got shot in the chest and they said it's all over. And 10 days later or so, the nurse sees this little kid and he's running down the hallway in a Superman outfit where, they thought there was no hope for this kid. And you hear about that, quite a lot.
Right. No, there are these miracles. So, a few days ago, I was asked to give a talk by Zoom to a group of healthcare professionals in the Midwest. And one of the things that they consulted with me about trauma, how people deal with trauma, and the sort of tribe of healthcare workers that they are. And I did my best to advise them. But one of the issues, one of the things they really struggled with, is that they said because of the sort of politics around COVID, that they really were being vilified. In fact, they were being blamed for COVID. And a little bit like, let's go back to the 1960s, 1970s, soldiers coming back from Vietnam being blamed for the war, right? Sort of analogous to that. Like, what are you talking about? They're just soldiers. They're just nurses. They're just doctors. Like what? So is that something that you've had to navigate, that your subjects have talked about? It must be incredibly painful to be vilified in any way by people you're trying to help. What does that feel like for them?
Well, to lead off, we really started this prior to COVID. Literally, it was about the same time. I can't remember, Jim, whether it was March or April, but somewhere in there we started the interviews, and we particularly wanted to not make it all COVID related. Like, we'll save the COVID for the end. And the only reason I throw that out is that, there was never discussions about vaccines. This was all still running to the sound of gunfire. This is all still these, administrators don't have a solution, and these nurses are our troops in the trenches, that they're out doing heroic stuff. So, I throw that out there that, they just were, more than anything, I think, tired, just tired, because it was just, a guy goes to Chicago, a traveling nurse gets to Chicago, and, 12 of his patients die in one day, and he's like, how do you process that? But I think we were doing a lot of the interviews before some of what you were talking about, Sebastian, happened. We are right now doing interviews for a book on cops, and that you do feel it big time. And right. You feel most cops, they want the bad apples out of there. They don't, they do. And they realize that things need to change. And they also feel neighborhoods need to change.
You can't you can't change the department and then we come in and you throw rocks at the cars. It doesn't work.
Right.
But I mean, but most of them, on the other hand, they also feel like, I mean, you'll sit there and go like, I've never even fired my gun and people look at me like I'm a killer. You know what I mean? It just, so that, I mean, we are feeling it right now in terms of the interviews and then turning the interviews into stories. There's a lot of hurt feelings and whatever. And a lot of these people, most of them don't deserve it.
Right. Oh, of course. So this, obviously wouldn't have been in your book, but I assume you're in contact with some of the people that you interviewed. And there's this whole issue of freedom right now in this country, and freedom around wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, getting a vaccine, not getting a vaccine. I wrote a book about freedom, which doesn't touch on any of this whatsoever, but it's a topic that interests me. Did the people that any people that you're in touch with that you interviewed, do they have any thoughts about all of our freedom as Americans to do or not do what we please? Like, is that, you know what I mean? Is that
one of the things that came up a lot are where somebody died and they weren't vaccinated. And they said, I was a freaking idiot.
Yeah.
Not to get. And I think there's a lot of like when you're getting these people that are coming in here and all of a sudden they want the freedom except when they come into the hospital and it's like, okay, take care of me now.
Right.
So I think there was a lot of resentment about that.
I bet there was. Yeah. So we're coming up. Come up to the end here where I'm going to start taking some questions from the audience. But let me just ask I was going to ask what's your next project? It sounds like it's a book on cops. That's the next thing you guys are working on?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And is it?
And it's stunning. And it's an amazing thing. The difference between the military personalities, the nurse, I won't get into too deeply into this, the nurse personalities and then the police personalities, very different, very different interviews.
And sort of different personality types for those professions.
Matt, yeah, I think so. But Matt?
Yeah, it's a great study because, there's the overarching umbrella of selflessness and, identity to serve and take care of our, two of the three are community focused and one is sort of nationally focused. But they are spectacularly different too, from a lot of different lenses, which is very, very interesting for me too, truly from thinking, comparing each to my Army experience. But as Jim said, most of us know is what we see on the idiot box. And whatever our flavor is, that's what we get. And, with these books and now with our third one, you just get to put it out and then people can make up their minds on what they think is right. And
more than anything else, I think for both of us, this idea of writing a book that will really change the way people think. They will really understand something that they thought they understood. And it's true of the military book for sure. I think it's true of the nurse book, and I think it'll be true of the cops book. It will just change. You will understand. And we, unfortunately right now, we seem to be going through this period of people with almost no understanding of something have come to these ironclad points of view. But you get the information and then decide. But that I find that a very wonderful thing to do. And I'd love to do one on teachers, honestly, because I think people think they understand, but they don't understand how difficult it is to be a teacher, how challenging, how rewarding, et cetera. I think they have a little thing in their heads, but it's just not accurate.
Sometimes people ask me about the phrase that is often used with soldiers or veterans, "Thank you for your service," and what I think about that phrase. And personally, I say, well, it's a fine phrase. It's a little bit reflexive, but it doesn't do any harm really. But don't stop with soldiers. If you're going to be thanking people for service, it takes a lot of people to keep this country running. And, it takes teachers, it takes firemen, it takes cops, it takes nurses, et cetera. And I sort of run through the list, and I'm realizing that fair amount of the list that I use with people, you guys are writing books about. It's wonderful. I think that'll help.
Well, a piece of it, Sebastian, is in terms of with the soldiers. It was the next time you thank somebody for your service, you'll know what you're thanking them for.
Yeah.
And similarly with the nurses, and in the ER nurses, they don't get much thanks at all because somebody is either out of there or they go up in the next floor, and it's precious to them when somebody does come back.
Yeah, right.
For whatever reason. I mean, it really has a tremendous effect because they don't get the thank yous.
Right. Well, I'm actually circling back. I've tracked down the guy who was in the back of the ambulance with me, and his girlfriend happened to be the nurse in the ICU that told me that wonderful thing. And I'm circled back, and I'm going to interview them and thank them. Good. I saw them on the worst day of my life, and they saved my life. And so listen, I'm going to attempt the impossible, which is to see if I can click over to the questions and then make it back into the Zoom session.
And we were doing so well.
So
37 minutes.
Sit tight, and I'm going to click over, and I'll be right back with the next.
If we lose you, Matt and I will just continue somehow.
Yeah, good. No, I think this is going to work. Okay, you guys can hear me, right? All right, Daniel, I'll just read the first question. It's pretty good. Daniel asks, without giving anything away, is there something in the interviews that we would find shocking to learn? And was there a common thread that could connect all of the interviews?
Matt, you want to start?
I tell you, the thing that shocked me the most was how dangerous this job is. I mean, back to Jim's underbelly comment, nurses that are punched, and I'm not talking just men on men, everybody, 5'1" nurses get in fights with 6'5" patients, strangled with IV tubes, lashed out at with machetes, and you name it, it's happened. People almost choked out. I had no idea about that. And again, they dust themselves off and they come back up and they lead with their chin. And that kind of leads into the second part of that question from my piece, Daniel, is that, they really are committed to this service, whether they're, super friendly or maybe a little nurse ratchety sometimes, as they're allowed to be, but they're there to serve and they're there to make you well. That's it. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. So let's see. Susan asks, Mr. Patterson, do you work on several books at once, or do you finish one book before you start a new one?
I work on a lot at the same time. We had a journalist in here at one point, and invariably when they come to visit, they have people, once again, they get a little bit of information and they think they understand. And that's why I'm so big on doing things where people finally understand. But people will come in there and they go like, I didn't get it, now I get it. They just did that. And I remember there was one, I was doing these short novellas, and it was a very ambitious project. And I started pulling these drawers out with all these, and that year, in addition to writing 2 books, I did 2,600 pages of outlines. And I'm pulling these drawers out, and the journalist is going, this is crazy. And then he looked at me and said, James, you are crazy. So whatever it is, I enjoy doing it. I don't work for a living. I play for a living. So
right. You're a lucky man. So someone named Sirhabi asks, do you think your interviews were almost cathartic for the nurses? What do you guys think?
Oh, I would agree. I mean, I can't say definitively, but you mentioned it earlier, Sebastian, about the soldiers, and I have been told to me when we came back. I mean, 30 years ago, almost from Mogadishu. I absolutely is, and I have multiple, many, if not all, always said thank you, so earnestly, thank you. And now that the book's out, and last week you get these emails from them that thank Mr. Patterson. You no doubt in my mind that sharing. I don't want to sound Dr. Philish, but You know, they
Well,
get to
and now we're getting it. I mean, the reviews, people reviews, whatever. It's just like it's very gratifying. I mean, just the thank you for telling our stories.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Patty asks, were there any differences in the perspective of nurses who had been in the profession for a long time versus nurses who were newer to the profession?
As I recall, somebody explained it to me like halfway through the whole process. Someone said it was like one of those hierarchy of needs kind of discussions. And they're like, you know, these are the 5 stages of your nursing career that everybody goes through. And I'm like, oh, that was really interesting. And yeah, I think the longer you're in, you know, what comes to mind, there's a great, we interviewed a mother and a daughter separately, both ER nurses. And, you know, the daughter opens up saying how, you know, she cries herself to sleep every night, you know, on her pillow, can't do it anymore. And her mom, of course, gives her this, again, one more day, one more week, kind of get through it. And then she deals with something, realizes the daughter can do it on her own, and boom, off they go. You know, that kind of stuff, you're like, yeah, this, it takes a lot of patience, maturity, and wisdom. And these nurses, I think, the longer they're in.
One of the things with the young nurses is, and they'll talk about this a lot, that you don't really experience a lot of this stuff in nursing school. So the first time you've ever done it, this is a real person. This is a real, oh my God, I got it. You know, I've never done that before. Even with cops, you hear people watch television and they think it's easy to put handcuffs on somebody who doesn't want to get no, try it sometime, you know. But here it's, you know, and they're going, and almost everything they do for the first time, it's like, oh my God, I got to do this. Oh my God, you know. So in the beginning, a lot of it is, I've never done that before. Or in some cases, you know, you do it 4, 5, 6 times and it still is very difficult. So that's a piece of it.
Right. All right. Michael asks, there were a lot of difficult and painful stories that were shared. Are there joyous and uplifting stories as well?
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. You know, we talked about like the Superman cape and the bringing the retriever in. There's one in there in which some nice group brought stuffed animals for the kids, and this one nurse brought them all around where all the kids were sleeping. And then there's one about a woman. She was at this costume party, and she's saving somebody in a lion outfit. Yeah, so there are, and we tried to make sure that that we mixed in the really uplifting stuff, and that's part of what gets these nurses going too. You know, that some of it is uplifting. They do save somebody, and I mean, a lot of people do walk out of the emergency room.
Yeah, no, I mean, Jim, I was just thinking.
Most people do walk out of the emergency room.
Yeah. Well, I did. I mean,
well, that was a little extreme.
So Margaret asks, how do nurses emotionally heal from one case to another without feeling personally responsible when the patient dies? In the long run, does it fall more on the doctor or on the nurse emotionally when a patient dies?
You know, we cover that a lot of times, you know, with these men and women, and, you know, nobody's cornered the market on, you know, sadness, and, you know, they never got into a point of, you know, anybody blaming anybody or name calling. But I think it's fair to say, you know, that everybody's got feelings. They all do, every single one. Some are able to just, you know, push it, drive on to the next one, you know, close that curtain literally and figuratively, move on. Others stew about it. You know, I mean, I think as many nurses as we interviewed, everybody's got a little bit of a different.
And not everybody is cut out to be emergency room nurse or ICU nurses. Just similarly, not everybody is cut out in the military to be in combat.
Right.
There's some people are, some people aren't. And if they aren't, they probably figure it out relatively quickly.
Right. Oh, well, listen, maybe we'll do one last question here. And this is a good question, I think. It's anonymous, but Did many nurses talk to you about about work-family tensions, especially because they embodied all the work risks? I assume that means COVID. Did they formulate protocols for navigating work-family conflict? What do you think of that?
Oh, interesting.
Once again, we didn't too much get into COVID because a lot of it was early. So some of that didn't come up as strongly as it would, I think, if we did it. One of the interesting things about the nurses in COVID is, nobody was prepared for it. But of all the people, certainly right at the top of the list would be emergency room nurses, because they're so used to intense trauma.
Right.
And nobody could get, the number of deaths and the overcrowding, when nobody could be prepared for that. But they were better prepared for it than most people. It's clearly it puts a strain on relationships, and it's the same with cops and military too. Somebody's gone for a year, whatever the heck it is. That's tough.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes it's hard to be a journalist and a writer as well, right? That can create problems as well, and any of these professions can really sweep people away emotionally. And I think that can lead to complications with the family, because you really go to another place emotionally or geographically, and reentry is awfully hard. And I imagine it must be very hard for an ER nurse to come back from, a traumatizing Friday or Saturday night in an urban, ER center, back to their family and their home and their children. That the transition, soldiers transition over some weeks or whatever from the combat zone. How about transitioning in a couple of hours or in half an hour? That must be incredibly hard. Any of them talk about that?
Yeah. Well, a fair number of the marriages are people, where the husband and wife both, they're similar kinds of careers.
Right.
A lot of them, both medical, that kind of thing. That probably helps some. Probably helps a lot.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to wind up pretty soon. Either of you guys have any last things you want to say?
This was great. And once again, Sebastian, I can't tell you, and you know how this is, when you get in, somebody's read your book, and what you said about it is it's just stunning. And Matt and I, we sat there reading the thing over and over again, going like, can't believe that somebody would have the reaction you had. And Sanjay Gupta actually sent us a very nice one too. And it's whatever. We're human, and it's a wonderful thing. So thank you.
Well, you had a middle-aged man crying in an airplane seat. If you can do that as a writer, you're going to do pretty well. Matt, any last words?
Yeah, no, I just echo Jim's comments. First of all, thank you for your kind thoughts. And, it just dawned on me as I was listening to you and Jim chatting about, this transition, they do in a half hour what a soldier does. And, I think if I were going to just chime in, I would throw on that there's always something that keeps them coming back. Maybe it's something miraculous. Maybe it's something really caring that happened, the Katie Quick, bring the dog home, or just something absurd of sharing a Coke and a smile with somebody. But there's always something for them that brings them back and helps them sort of refresh and restart. And, it dawned on me, like, it's not all bad. And they're not all, you don't got to walk, they're toughies. You don't got to walk on eggshells around them. They suffer fools lightly. They just want to be on that team. So I throw it out to the audience. They're part of our communities. They're awesome. You're a great man for all you've done for our soldiers, and now for Jim and me on this. So I appreciate it. I'm honored to be a part of this evening.
Well, listen, gentlemen, thank you. It was my pleasure, and a wonderful hour we spent together. I assume the audience loved it. I'm sure they did. And everyone, please read this book. It's an important one for America right now.
And thanks to our friend Lois, who put Sebastian and I together.
Yeah, and Lois, absolutely. Thank you, Lois. Goodbye. Hopefully we'll meet in the flesh someday, and good luck with your next book.
Thank you. Matt?
Jim, always a pleasure. Looking sharp. Have a great evening.
Bye.